Welcome to Today I Will Take You on a Journey into My Own World. The Keeper of the Slow River. A story for the quiet hour, when the day is finished and the night has nothing to ask of you. There is a river in the northern part of the valley that moves so slowly you have to watch it for a long time before you are certain it is moving at all. The locals call it the Slow River, which is not a poetic name, but an accurate one. And accuracy has always mattered more to them than poetry. The woman who kept the river was named Marin. She had been keeping it for 31 years, since she was 22, and had come to the valley for reasons she no longer remembered precisely. Something about a summer. Something about needing to be somewhere quiet for a while. And the while had extended itself in the graceful way that whiles sometimes do, until it was no longer a while, but simply a life. Her house sat on the bank at the river's widest point, where the water spread itself over a bed of smooth, pale stones, and became, for 100 meters, more lake than river. Shallow and still and full of light on clear days, so clear that you could see every stone on the bottom and every small fish moving between them with the unhurried ease of creatures who have no appointments and no concerns beyond the current moment. The house was small. This was deliberate. Marin had found over 31 years that small spaces encouraged a particular quality of attention. You noticed more because there was less to navigate, fewer surfaces to overlook, fewer corners where things could go unobserved. She knew every creak of the floorboards, knew which window latch needed lifting slightly before it would turn, knew the exact angle at which the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in late September and made the wooden table look like something carved from amber. Her days had a rhythm so established it had worn itself smooth, like the river stones, all the rough edges gone. She woke before the light, not because she needed to, but because she liked the particular quality of that in-between hour, when the darkness was preparing to give way and the first birds were beginning their consultations about the coming day. She made tea in the kitchen. She took it to the small bench outside the back door, the one that faced the river, and she sat and watched the water in the growing light. The river in early morning was different from the river at any other time. The mist came off it in slow curls, rising in the windless air and dispersing gradually. And the surface had a quality of stillness that was not quite the stillness of ice, but was its own thing. The stillness of something that is moving, but moving so slowly that the eye reads it as rest. She had spent 31 years watching it, and she still found it the most quietly beautiful thing she knew. After tea, she walked the bank. This was the keeping part. Not grand stewardship, not the management of something wild, but the simple attentiveness of someone who has agreed to notice. She noted the water level, which changed so gradually between seasons that you had to have been watching for years to read the change at all. She noted the health of the sedge along the banks, the behavior of the kingfishers who nested in the low overhang of the southern bend, the condition of the 3 wooden footbridges that crossed the river between her house and the village 2 kilometers downstream. The village was called Vend. It had 412 people, and a bakery, and a school, and a hardware store, and an inn that served good soup and not much else in the way of food, which was enough, because the people of Vend were not demanding about their food. They grew things in their gardens and kept chickens and fished the river with the patient expertise of people who have been fishing the same water for generations and know exactly where the fish are and when. Marin went to the village on Thursdays. She bought what she needed: tea, flour occasionally, the cheese that the farmer's wife made in small rounds that kept well and tasted of the particular grasses of the upper meadow. She talked to people. She had known them for 31 years, and they had known her, and the knowing had the quality of old furniture. Comfortable, settled, no longer requiring any particular effort to inhabit. Old Peter at the hardware store always asked about the river's level. His family had farmed the low field beside the river for 4 generations, and the level mattered to him in the practical, immediate way that the level of something matters when your livelihood depends on it. She told him. He nodded and went back to whatever he was doing behind the counter, satisfied. This exchange had been occurring in one form or another for 30 years. The baker, a young woman named Sonia, who had arrived from the city 7 years ago and had stayed, as people sometimes stayed in Vend, as though the valley had a gentle gravitational pull, always gave Marin the end pieces of the bread loaves at no charge. Not from charity, Sonia was precise about this, but because the end pieces dried out fastest, and Marin made good use of them, and this was simply efficient. They discussed the river and the weather and the behavior of the swallows, who had arrived 2 weeks early that year, and whose arrival Sonia found, for reasons she could not explain, deeply reassuring. Marin walked home with her provisions along the river path. The path was worn smooth by her 31 years of Thursday use, and by however many years of whoever had walked it before her. The river was always on her right on the return journey, accompanying her, moving in its barely perceptible way toward the lake at the valley's southern end, where it eventually widened into something large enough to have a different name. She did not hurry. There was never any reason to hurry. The things waiting at home were patient things: the garden, the woodpile, the evening. The book was reading. The river itself, which would be doing exactly what it was doing now in an hour, and in 3 hours, and in the morning, and would continue doing it long after any urgency she might manufacture had dissolved back into the irrelevance from which it came. In spring, the river ran faster. Not much, but noticeably, carrying snowmelt from the high places and moving with a slightly more purposeful quality, a sense of business. Marin liked spring for its energy, but preferred the river in summer and autumn, and especially in the slow, gray days of early winter, when the water was at its most deliberate, when it seemed to have considered the matter and concluded that there was no advantage to speed. The evenings she spent reading, or in the garden, or, on clear nights, sitting outside long enough to watch the stars come out in their gradual fashion. The valley was dark enough. No city nearby, no lights above a certain modest level, that the stars were fully visible. And she had learned their patterns over 31 years, the way she had learned everything else in this place, through repetition and patience, and the particular pleasure of watching something familiar reveal new aspects. She knew the winter stars and the summer stars, and the particular configuration of planets that appeared every few years in the west at dusk, and which she had now seen 4 times, each time alone, each time with the quiet pleasure of something expected and welcome arriving on schedule. She slept well. This seemed worth noting, because not everyone does, and she knew it, and was grateful for it, in the specific way you are grateful for things you once did not have, and then found and kept. She had not always slept well. There had been a time, before the valley, before the river, in the life she had lived before the while that became a life, when sleep was a thing she negotiated with, an uncertain outcome at the end of each long day. The river had changed that, or the valley had. Or the accumulated weight of 31 years of quiet days, each one adding its sediment to the riverbed of her, building up gradually into something deep and stable and resistant to disturbance. She slept, and the river moved, and the village slept, and the kingfishers on the southern bend tucked their vivid heads under their wings, and the stones on the riverbed shifted their position by fractions, and the stars completed their slow arcs overhead, and the valley held all of it with the vast, unhurried patience of a place that has been holding things for a very long time and expects to go on doing so. In the mornings, she made tea and sat on the bench and watched the river in the growing light. This was the keeping of the river. Not much in the accounting of things. Everything in the accounting of things. She had once tried to explain to a visitor, someone who had come to the valley for a summer and who asked a great many questions with the energy of someone to whom questions had always been the primary mode of engagement, why she had stayed. Why 31 years? Why here? Why this particular stretch of slow water? Why the small house and the Thursday walks and the kingfishers and old Peter and his questions about the level? She had thought about it for a while. Then she had said, "Because it is enough, all of it together, the river and the days and the people and the light on the water in the mornings. It is exactly enough, no more and no less. And I have found that exactly enough is a very rare thing and worth staying for." The visitor had written this down in the small notebook she carried. Marin had watched her write it and thought, "You will go back to your city and your questions and your notebook, and maybe someday you will understand what I mean. And maybe you won't. And either way, the river will keep moving, which is all it has ever done, which is enough." The visitor left at the end of the summer. Marin stayed. She is still there. The bench is worn smooth where she sits. The path to the village is worn smooth where she walks. The river moves in its imperceptible way toward the lake, carrying everything with it gently, the way good rivers do. Not rushing, not forcing, just continuing, just flowing, just being the thing it has always been in the place it has always been, untroubled by the passage of time, because time, for a river, is not a passage, but simply the medium in which it exists. The tea steams, the mist rises, the kingfishers wake. Another morning, exactly enough. The Lighthouse at the end of summer. For those who need somewhere quiet to rest before sleep, the lighthouse is always lit. The kettle is always on. The lighthouse had not been used for navigation in 40 years, since the electronic buoy system was installed and the Maritime Authority decided that human keepers were no longer necessary. But the light still turned, because the man who lived there turned it every night out of habit and out of a conviction he had never felt the need to examine closely. That a light kept faithfully is not wasted, even if no one needs it to steer by. His name was Oswald Finn, and he was 74 years old, and he had come to the lighthouse the summer he was 32, for reasons that had seemed urgent at the time and that he could no longer remember with any precision. He had a theory that the things which feel most urgent in our 30s are usually the things that matter least, and the things that turn out to matter, the slow accumulations, the daily habits, the quality of light at particular hours, reveal themselves only gradually and without announcement. The lighthouse stood on a narrow promontory on the coast, reached by a single road that was barely a road, more the memory of a road, a suggestion of one, passable in dry weather and determined weather, and impassable in the kind of mud-deep winter the coast occasionally produced. The sea was on 3 sides. On the 4th side, a kilometer inland, was the village of Bray's Point, which had 200 people, and a post office, and a pub, and a small shop that sold everything necessary and a great deal that was unnecessary, which was how small shops survived. Oswald walked to the village on most days, not always. In genuinely bad weather, he stayed in, and the staying in was not unpleasant. The lighthouse was warm and well stocked, and the sound of rain on the lantern room glass was one of his favorite sounds, a constant percussive texture that made the interior feel even more interior, even more like a place carved out of the wet world and kept separate from it by intention and stone. The summer the young woman arrived was an ordinary summer in most respects. The sea was blue and occasionally green, and on one memorable afternoon in August, an extraordinary shade of pewter that he had tried to describe to someone in a letter and had failed, the color existing in a register slightly outside what language was designed for. The wildflowers on the cliff above the lighthouse were particularly good that year, the mild winter and the wet spring having produced a display that he walked up to look at every few days, not from any particular botanical interest, but because some things are worth looking at just because they are there. The young woman's name was Petra. She appeared at his door on a Tuesday in early July with a small bag and a letter from a mutual acquaintance, a writer he had known decades ago who had stayed in the Lighthouse guest room for 3 weeks one autumn and produced, apparently, the best work of her career, and who had been sending people to Oswald ever since with a note that said, in variations, "This person needs somewhere quiet." He trusted her judgment. Petra was 26 and had the look of someone who had been moving very fast for a long time and had recently, and perhaps not entirely voluntarily, stopped. There was a stillness about her that was not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of something wound very tight that has been set down and has not yet remembered how to unwind. He recognized it. He had had it himself the summer he was 32. He showed her the guest room, which was on the 2nd level of the lighthouse, with a circular wall and a view of the sea on 2 sides, and a bed that had held many people who needed it. The room had a quality he had noticed over the years. Every guest mentioned it eventually, usually on the 2nd or 3rd day, with some surprise, as though they hadn't expected it. A sense of being held, not confined, held. The curve of the walls, the weight of the stone, the sound of the sea, whatever combination of physical things produced the feeling, it was consistent and real. And several of his guests had, he knew, slept in that room better than they had slept anywhere in years. Petra slept for 12 hours the first night. He knew this because the lighthouse had a natural acoustic quality. The stone carried sound in particular ways, not intrusively, not like hearing conversations, but like a general awareness of the building's inhabited or uninhabited state. He heard her go quiet at 9, and heard her stir at 9 the following morning, and he made tea and left it on the table in the kitchen, and went about his own day without disturbance. This was the art of the thing, as he had come to understand it over decades of occasional guests. Not to manage them, not to program their recovery, not to offer more than what they needed. Most people needed very little. They needed a place that was stable while they were not. They needed someone who was not worried about them. They needed the ordinary things done around them: meals at reasonable times, warmth, the particular reassurance of a space that functions without requiring anything from them. He cooked simple food: soup and bread in the evenings, eggs in the mornings, whatever the village shop had that was good that week. He was not a skilled cook in any ambitious sense, but he had learned over 40 years to cook well enough that eating was a pleasure rather than a task, and this seemed sufficient. Petra ate with the appetite of someone in whom basic things were reasserting themselves, not dramatically, just steadily, the way strength comes back. They talked in the evenings, usually, not always. He never initiated if she seemed to want quiet, and she seemed to develop over the first week an instinct for when he was available and when he was absorbed in something else, and she adapted to his rhythms rather than imposing her own, which was a quality he found he appreciated. She was a doctor, not practicing currently, on a leave that she described vaguely and without detail. He did not ask for detail. He had found that the details usually arrived on their own when the person was ready for them, and that asking before then was counterproductive, not impolite, just counterproductive, like opening a window before the bread has risen. The detail arrived on a Thursday in her third week over soup without preamble. She had made a mistake, a clinical mistake, the kind that was within the acceptable range of outcomes in her field, but that she could not, despite everything she knew professionally about acceptable ranges and statistical inevitability, incorporate into her sense of herself. She had known, going in, that medicine was a field in which acceptable range mistakes happened to good practitioners. She had not known what it would feel like when one happened to her. Oswald listened. He did not offer reassurance because she was not looking for reassurance. She was a doctor. She knew the statistics. She had the professional context. She did not need another version of "it is not your fault." What she needed was someone to hear it without fixing it, and he was good at that. When she finished, he said, "The light. Come and watch me turn on the light." She looked at him. He stood, and she followed him up the stairs, the lighthouse staircase, circular, narrow, worn smooth in the center of each step by 40 years of his footsteps, and however many footsteps before that, to the lantern room at the top. The glass surrounded them on all sides. The sun was going down over the sea, the water turning the particular colors it turned at that hour, and the automatic mechanism that he still, by choice, ran manually, had been waiting all day for this. He turned on the light. She had seen the lighthouse from below, of course. She had watched it from the guest room window and from the cliff walk, its beam turning in the dark. Being inside it when it started was different. The light was very large and very bright, and it turned with a slow, powerful certainty, and the room rotated in it, and the sea outside was illuminated in arcs, each one brief and complete, the beam sweeping out across the water and coming around again. He said, "No ship needs this anymore. The buoys handle navigation. This light is technically redundant." She said, "Then why?" He said, Because I think there is value in a light kept faithfully, whether or not anyone needs to steer by it. Because I think the keeping matters, even when the specific utility has been superseded. Because some mornings I see a fishing boat come in early, and the beam sweeps across it on its way to harbor, and I think, even if it doesn't need it, it has it. Even if it can find its own way, there is a light. She looked at the beam sweeping out and coming back. She said nothing for a long time. She stayed for another week. When she left, she was not fixed. He never thought of his guests as needing to be fixed, which was perhaps the most useful thing about him. But she was something else. Rested, maybe. Reoriented. Like a compass that had been next to a magnet and then moved away and was slowly settling back to north. She wrote to him afterward, several times over the years. He wrote back in his careful way, telling her about the wildflowers on the cliff and the behavior of the seabirds and the quality of the winter light. She told him she had gone back to practice. She told him she had told a colleague about the acceptable range mistake, and the colleague had said it had happened to her too, and they had talked for 2 hours and both felt better. She told him that she thought about the lighthouse often. He turned the light on every evening. He climbed the circular stairs with the familiar pressure of each worn step underfoot. The beam swept out and came back. The sea held it for a moment, and then let it go. The way the sea holds and lets go of everything, without preference, without judgment, receiving the light and releasing it and receiving it again. The kettle was usually on. The guest room was usually ready. The light was always kept. That was the whole of it, and it was entirely enough. The Cartographer of Ordinary Days. He had been mapping the same town for 50 years. Not its streets, those had been mapped. He was mapping something else entirely. The maps that Ellery Voss made were not maps in the conventional sense. They did not show roads or elevation contours or the boundaries between one jurisdiction and another. They showed other things. The path that the morning light took across the town square between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox, marked in golden ink on a pale background, curving as the sun's angle changed. The places where rain collected in particularly satisfying pools after a storm. The spots on the bridge railing where people rested their hands when they stopped to look at the river, worn smooth by 100 years of this gesture. He had been making these maps for 50 years, since he was 30 and had retired from the work he had done before. Something with numbers, something competent and unremarkable. Something that had paid well and that he had walked away from on a Tuesday morning in October with. The calm certainty of someone who has finally understood what they are supposed to do and cannot wait another day to begin doing it. The town was called Aldmere. It was a medium-sized town in a temperate climate, with a river and a bridge and a square and the usual assortment of streets branching off from these central features in the organic pattern of towns that were not planned, but accumulated, building by building, decade by decade, according to the logic of whoever needed a building in a particular place at a particular time. Ellery had grown up in Aldmere, which meant he had the particular relationship with it that people have with places they know before they know themselves. Not the relationship of the traveler, who sees a place as a whole and responds to its character, but the relationship of the native, for whom a place is not a whole, but a texture. a weave of specific and particular things experienced one at a time over many years until they become inseparable from the self that experienced them. His maps were an attempt to make this texture visible. The first maps were rough. He had not been trained, had learned as he went, developing his own notation system and his own conventions for representing things that conventional cartography had no symbols for. The map of the morning light, for instance, had taken him 3 attempts over 3 years before he found a way to show what he meant. Not where the light fell, which was simple enough, but the quality of it. The particular warmth of September light in this specific square, as opposed to the harder brightness of July, which was different again from the thin gold of November that appeared for perhaps 20 minutes before the buildings on the western side blocked it entirely. He used color extensively, which was unusual in cartography. He had developed a palette of 47 colors, each mixed by hand, each corresponding to a specific quality of the things he mapped. The color he called bench warmth was a deep amber rose that he used to indicate places where people lingered comfortably. The specific bench near the fountain that was sheltered from the prevailing wind and caught the afternoon sun. The step outside the baker's that had a good view of the comings and goings of the square, and where the baker herself often stood in the mid-morning with her coffee. The color he called river deep still was a blue-gray he used to show the places in the river visible from the bridge where the water was most transparent in autumn, when the levels were low and the light was right, and you could see clear to the bottom, to the pebbles and the occasional dark shape of a fish holding position in the current. He worked every day. Not all day. The morning hours were for walking, for observing, for the accumulation of the material from which maps were made. The afternoons were for the studio, a room in his house that had been given over entirely to this purpose. Its walls, covered in finished and in-progress maps, its tables spread with the tools of the work, the pens and brushes and papers, the color jars in their careful order, the notebooks full of observations written in his small, precise hand. He was known in Aldmere. Not famous. The town was too modest for fame, and he was too quiet for it in any case, but known, in the way that people are known in towns they have lived in for 80 years, which is the completest kind of knowing, the knowing that includes childhood and grief and the long middle of a life and the current configuration of old age, all of it visible to people who have been watching long enough to have seen it all unfold. The children from the school came to see his maps every year in the spring. He enjoyed this. The children asked better questions than adults because they had not yet decided what was and was not worth knowing, and so they asked about everything with an indiscriminate curiosity that he found professionally sympathetic. Why, this color here? What does this symbol mean? Is this the place where the light is golden? Can we see it? Can we go? He took them, when he could. He took them to the square in the afternoon and showed them the angle of the light. He took them to the bridge and pointed out the worn places on the railing and let them put their hands in the smooth hollows made by 100 years of other hands and feel the particular texture of stone shaped by human contact over time. He took them to the bench near the fountain, and they sat in the shelter of the windbreak and felt the difference between the air there and the air 5 meters away where the wind came in off the river. And they understood, in the wordless, physical way that children understand things before they have the language for them, what his maps were about. They were about paying attention. This was, at its simplest, the whole project. 50 years of paying attention to one place, of finding in the ordinary particular, and in the particular the remarkable, of insisting that a town was not just its streets and buildings, but the full texture of experience that accumulated in it every day. The light and the warmth and the sounds and the worn places and the patterns of movement and the small, reliable pleasures that made the people who lived there feel, without necessarily being able to say why, that they were in a good place. He had a long-running map he called the Comfort Index, which was his favorite and which he worked on continuously and would never finish, because it was by nature unfinishable. A map of the town showing, in a gradient from pale to deep, the places where comfort accumulated. The bench, the baker's step, the reading room at the library on winter afternoons when the radiators were warm and the light outside was gray and inside was a different quality of gray, softened by lamplight and the smell of old paper. The comfort was not dramatic. This was the point. He had spent 50 years arguing, in the patient visual language of his maps, that the remarkable things were not elsewhere, were not in other places or other times, were not reserved for extraordinary occasions. The remarkable things were the morning light on this specific square, and the worn spot on this specific railing, and the warmth of this specific bench in the afternoon of an ordinary October day. He was 80 years old. He walked more slowly now, and the morning walks were shorter, but they were still the morning walks, still the daily accumulation, still the looking and the noting, still the color jars and the notebooks and the maps spreading across the studio walls in their patient, unhurried completeness. He had not mapped everything. He would not map everything. There was more here than 50 years of attentive mapping had touched. More light patterns, more worn places, more pockets of comfort tucked into corners he had not yet found, or had found and not yet rendered. Town was inexhaustible in this way. Every place was inexhaustible, he had come to believe, if you were willing to look long enough and closely enough. If you were willing to spend 50 years on a single town and find at the end of that time that you had barely begun. This was not a discouraging thought. It was, in fact, the most encouraging thought he had. There was always more to see. The world was not running out of itself. In the evenings, he sometimes sat on the bench near the fountain. Bench warmth, amber rose on the comfort index, sheltered from the prevailing wind, afternoon sun now gone, but the stone still holding the day's heat. He sat and watched the square settle into evening, the light changing, the people changing their pace as the day let go of its obligations and became the gentle, undemanding thing that evenings are. The fountain made its small sound. The river, somewhere below, made its own, smaller sound. The lights came on in the buildings around the square, one by one. Warm rectangles appearing in the stone facades, not all at once, gradually, the way stars come out, each one individually, each one a small, specific addition to the general warmth of an inhabited place in the evening. He watched this every evening he could. He had never mapped it. Some things were beyond mapping, or perhaps simply didn't need it, were complete in themselves and needed only to be witnessed, attended to, held in the attention with the same patient faithfulness with which the lighthouse keeper turned the light. An old woman with a dog walked across the square. A child ran from one side to the other, following something only it could see. A couple stopped at the bridge railing and rested their hands in the worn hollows and looked at the river below. He watched. The square held them all with the comfortable indifference of spaces that have been holding people for a long time. The evening came on. The stars, where they could be seen above the town's modest light, appeared in their gradual fashion. He thought, "I have been looking at this place for 80 years, and I am still not done looking. I will not be done. There is always another light, another warmth, another worn place where a hand has rested. The place does not run out of itself." He thought, "This is enough. This has always been enough." He walked home slowly in the warm evening, through streets he had mapped 100 times and that still, on certain evenings, showed him something new. A shadow cast in an angle he hadn't recorded, a reflection in a window that lasted for only the precise moment of a particular light at a particular hour, and would not occur again until the same conditions aligned. Maybe next year, maybe in 5 years, maybe never again in quite the same way. He went inside. He made tea. He sat in the studio among the maps, in the lamplight, with the quiet sounds of the town at evening coming through the window. The fountain, the distant river, the occasional voice, the small sounds of a place that is inhabited and warm and going about its gentle evening business. He opened his notebook. He wrote one more observation in his small, precise hand before he closed it for the night. The notebook did not record what he wrote. It did not matter. It was one more small thing added to the great accumulation of small things, 50 years of them. Each one its own complete moment. Each one an act of attention paid to the ordinary world and its inexhaustible texture. He set the notebook aside. He finished his tea. The lamplight was warm. The town was quiet. He closed his eyes. Outside, the fountain continued its small sound, and the river continued its smaller sound, and the stars moved in their patient arcs above the rooftops, and the stone of the old buildings held the day's warmth for a little longer, and everything was exactly as it had been, and exactly as it would be, which was, he had found over 80 years, one of the most deeply restful things about the world. It continued. It simply and reliably continued. He slept. Welcome to Today I Will Take You on a Journey into My Own World.